Thanks so much, everyone, for making the time to come. I think you'll be really glad you did today because the speakers that we have are people that I have been trying to recruit to come speak to the Readiness and Adoption Committee and even the coalition-wide meeting for several months following the release of some of their academic research that has real value and insight for all of us on the practice side of the AI adoption and governance equation. So I'd like to welcome Ben Green, who's a professor at the University of Michigan, and Nell Escher, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of California, Berkeley. They'll share a bit more about their backgrounds and how they've come to be doing this work, but this will be a real treat today. And Albert, please help me share. Yes, go blue. That, indeed, Carol. Um, Albert, please help me share the hosting privileges. I'm not sure that I am a host of this meeting.
Absolutely. Give me 1 second. All right, you should have hosting abilities now.
Cool. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.
Take it away, Ben and Nell.
All right. Well,
And
yeah, cool. Thanks so much for inviting us. I'm really excited to speak to this group. Thanks especially Meg for connecting us and getting us set. Um, I will introduce us briefly while I'll let Nell kind of get the slides set up and work on sharing screen. Um, but yeah, we're excited to share this work. Both Nell and I have been working at the intersection of uh, technology and government for many years. I have a PhD in computer science and worked during my PhD for the city of Boston, and a lot of my academic research has focused on how algorithms and AI tools get deployed in government. And so, yeah, really excited to speak to this group, and I'll turn things over to Nell, who will kick off the presentation, and also she can introduce herself.
Thanks, Ben. Yeah, really excited to be here. I'm a huge GovAI fan. I am now, I have a JD and a PhD in computer science from Michigan. And as Ben was my advisor there. And we've been, yeah, really interested in kind of this e-government space, the idea that we're going to be using software to improve service delivery. So really excited to talk to you today about some work that we did with Nicola Banovich and Jeff Billick. Today we'll be talking about how law is translated into code and why policies have yet to deal with the resulting transformations.
and Nell, just real
Yeah.
quick for you and Ben, thank you again so much for being here in our Readiness and Adoption Committee to talk about this. Um, for people in the chat, and people that have questions as you're going, do you prefer that they save them to the end, put them in the chat, raise their hands?
I think saving, I would say feel free to put questions in the chat as we go. We'll probably save those until the end to respond, unless someone has like a really burning question where you're confused about something we're saying, then feel free to maybe raise your hand. But otherwise, feel free to put questions in the chat. But I think we'll try to do more of the Q&A at the end after we finish the talk. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
That
yeah,
work?
perfect.
Cool.
Awesome. Thanks. So translating the law into code has this tremendous promise. We could use legal software to make legal processes more efficient and expand access to justice. To this end, there's been a proliferation of software tools in e-government and nonprofit contexts, many of them DIY forms or calculators or applications for services. But these tools don't always get the law right. There have been devastating failures from mistranslations encoded in legal software. A prison software system in Arizona misencoded the formula for calculating sentences, and incarcerated prisoners past their release dates. A dozen states have faulty benefit systems, which have wrongly cut access to healthcare and food assistance and other vital welfare services. And a prior algorithmic audit I conducted found a Pennsylvania state tool discouraging eligible families from seeking subsidized childcare, along with many other problems. For the first project we'll discuss today, we wanted to understand why programmers encode mistranslations in software. What are practitioners actually doing when they sit down and develop these applications? In our experimental study, 15 teams composed of computer scientists or computer scientists working with lawyers worked together to translate a bankruptcy provision into software. We analyzed over 100 hours of screen recordings, chat transcripts, and code diffs generated every 30 seconds, and found that deviation from the law comes from both sides of the disciplinary divide. You can read this at your own peril, but here's the legal provision that our participants translated. The idea is that perhaps someone considering filing for bankruptcy would want to consult a tool that told them whether this was relevant to them rather than struggling through this block of text. All 15 of our participant teams constructed a web-based tool that helped people figure out whether or not these legal rules applied to their case. In our analysis, we found that computer scientists and lawyers approached this task through different, distinct disciplinary lenses. While computer scientists think creating legal software is easy, lawyers viewed our task as complex. Computer scientists think of people interacting with tools as users, but lawyers related to them as clients. For computer scientists, software is inspectable, but for lawyers, it's mostly black boxed, even if the code is displayed right in front of them. And computer scientists viewed their translations of law into code as direct representations of the law, while lawyers considered their software to only capture a simplified representation of law. But regardless of their approach, the participants struggled to create quality tools. We found very high rates of error in the 15 tools created. Only one interdisciplinary team and one computer science team managed to properly encode the relationships between bankruptcy subprovisions. The high error rates were perhaps unsurprising when we were dealing with computer science teams working by themselves, because these participants barely did any legal research on how the law worked. These teams spent about 7 minutes researching the law online compared to over 30 minutes of research performed by the interdisciplinary teams who came in with way more background knowledge. As one participant said, "I guess since we're just kind of asking questions, we don't really need to understand the reasoning behind the law." The computer scientists didn't think it was important to understand the law to build this software, but they did misunderstand the law, and then they encoded their misunderstandings into their tools. But why were there such high error rates for the interdisciplinary teams? Well, lawyers on the interdisciplinary teams did seem to understand how the law worked. They used standard legal research practices to find how the legal provision has been applied in the past, and they attempted to transmit their knowledge to their teammates, bridging the gap between their disciplines by using boundary objects such as outlines or diagrams or flowcharts to coordinate tool development. However, these specifications were often ambiguous, incoherent, or ignored. And lawyers didn't realize these shortcomings because they viewed testing as a technical task, a responsibility of their programmer partners. So a lot of legal scholars want to blame programmers for messing up the law, but we observed that lawyers also deviated from established legal practice when there were competing ways to interpret the law. The lawyers here systematically chose to adopt the strictest standards because they assumed that computer programs worked best over clearly defined and rigid categories. They provide a static list of things that courts have waived in the past. Check here if the debtor has a permanent illness. Check here if they have numerous dependents. The computational legal tools built in the study decide cases very differently than judges do. They aren't giving a debtor a chance to present their own circumstances. They're kind of freezing what the law currently is. So across the board, the tools created by the interdisciplinary teams were harsher and more strict about forgiving student loan debt than judges are. Briefly, though, I do want to call out this team who built the most successful tool in our study. They were an interdisciplinary team, and they did things a little bit different from the others. They worked hard to understand each other's domains. The lawyer explained how the law worked by reading out excerpts from real cases with sympathetic and vulnerable debtors, rather than using hypotheticals, which led both partners to express a lot of empathy for the people who might be consulting the tool. Additionally, the programmer explained how the code worked, how the files functioned together. So the lawyer was able to articulate his understanding of the law in pseudocode with if-else statements that narrowed the interpretive gap between boundary object and final design. But returning to the broader trends, We asked participants to reflect on their tools at the end of the study, and we found something interesting. Despite all the problems we observed in their tools, the very high error rates, most of the participants expressed confidence in their work and agreed to post their tools publicly. Computer scientists went even further, stating that their tools were suitable to replace judges in courtrooms, although all lawyers disagreed with this use. So while there seems to be an expectation prompting much of the excitement around translating the law to code, that it will amplify the reach of the legal system by neutrally conveying the law, we find that the process of encoding the law into software can distort the law in unexpected ways. Given that error is potentially pervasive and widespread, and that the causes of these errors are not trivial, unfortunately, we can expect that systems tasked with administering important government services will misapply the law. But does the law recognize these problems?
Okay, so I will take over for this next portion of the talk. And so, yeah, so this paper is kind of a follow-up project to the first one. So as Nell was describing, what we found is that the development of software for legal purposes runs into all of these issues in the development process, where it maybe seems straightforward to say, take a law and turn that into code. And we found these pretty significant barriers to that development that lead to errors and bugs with no simple solutions. So after doing that, we wanted to look at the downstream context of these tools. Yeah,
And
Albert, did you want to jump in?
yeah, sorry, just real quick, because I think what you're walking through is really fascinating, and I just want to pause and give the first paper that Nell walked us through a little bit of weight and open up a quick conversation for folks in the chat to ask about this. Because no, basically, please correct me if I'm misunderstanding this. Like basically, what you put together here, you demonstrated was a number of teams of what I feel like most of us would consider fairly qualified people, whether it be across computer science and law, coming together to build a tool that was meant to interpret something that on the surface felt like it could be automated. But in reality, there was a lot of struggle with that. And so I guess, okay, so it sounds like I've got a decent grasp on what was
Yeah,
going on.
glad to hear
Absolutely.
it.
Great. I'm curious, uh, and others, please ask questions in the chat, come off mute. Maybe just a starter question. That to me feels like it's potentially generalizable beyond the law field. And I'm curious if, like, in your research or what you've seen, is this a more generalizable trend that we're seeing, or how to think about these like tools being built?
Yeah, Nell, do you want to jump in on that, or I can?
I will say I do primarily focus on the legal context. That there has been some work, I think, in developing legal expert systems, though, for other disciplines. And I think it's easier for sort of interdisciplinary collaboration to happen when the fields are pretty close together. So, computer scientist talking to a nuclear engineer who maybe share a same like sort of engineering base and terminology, they might have an easier time developing a system together. But as soon as you kind of move to a discipline with sort of different ways of thinking and reasoning, such as law, such as policy, yeah, I think it's harder to necessarily translate between
Mhm.
those two domains.
Yeah, and I've definitely seen in my experience working with government agencies pretty similar dynamics. Like I would say the findings of this study didn't really surprise me based on things I've experienced where certainly I would say like it's pretty understood, or at least in our world, that, computer scientists and data scientists often don't really know about these other domains, especially ones like policy or law or government. But also that the sort of domain experts in, the lawyer or the policymaker on the team may not know enough about technology to kind of guide the technologist in the right direction, right? So like what we saw is the lawyer knows about the law, but they don't know how to tell the computer scientist how to encode the law. And I would say that that definitely checks out with some of my experience working with local governments, where I've seen like they know everything that there is to know pretty much about their own context and their agency, but sometimes they don't know what questions to ask of the data scientist, or they might say, "Can you build this thing for me?" And what they're asking for is something that would take years when they assume it would only take a couple of weeks to build. So that sense of calibration of like, how do you, as the domain expert, work with technologists and get on the same page? I think is a pretty generalizable finding, and one that speaks to kind of the need for education on both sides for technologists. Of course, how do you work with, within a context and work with partners or clients, but also for the sort of the client side of things, how do you know enough about technology and how
Mm.
technologists think to give them the right advice, to tell them, here's the thing I want you to build, or here's the questions I have for you, and to be engaged in that evaluation process. Because one of the biggest issues was that in our study was that the lawyers just kind of are like, I don't know the tech, I'm not going to deal with
Mm.
evaluation. And so
Yeah,
their expertise was not part of the final check to say, does this tool actually work? And I think had they been a little bit more informed and empowered, they could have done some of that testing and realized, no, this tool is not following the law as I understand it.
that's fascinating. And I think it really reflects what I hear a lot in the conversation, both from our vendor community and our government community, is the vendors also feel a disconnect or a lack of engagement on how to really benchmark or get their government folks aligned or how to engage them so that they can actually solve the real problems addressing them, is because there is that, like you said, that feeling of wanting to be hands off. And I think that's it brings value to the spaces where we can start bridging more of that gap.
Hmm.
So. Anyways, Eric, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, just a couple examples, and I know these are probably anecdotal, but and I did mention this in chat about nuance. So about 15 years ago, I was part of a proceedings in a court case, and our lawyers argued that since the other party had filed late, that we should have it thrown out. And the judge, he just kind of looks at it. They gave an explanation. He's like, "No, I'll let it proceed." And it's like, obviously, that's a hard line. If you had AI say, "Well, they filed late, so this case is going to get thrown out," but then you go to court, right? The judge could say other things, and again, it's nuance. It's things that AI probably doesn't understand that a legal team would. And the other part is, I work for Bolton and Mink. We're a civil engineering firm, and I do AI enablement. I build and agents and all these things. And the one thing that we tried testing was, we were doing these water lines and having the AI vision model look at the specs and see where the water lines were. But then what we found out is that so it can measure where the water line was in the ground. But when our teams went out there to look, the ground had shifted and the line had moved a couple inches to the north. And so again, nuance, AI can read the plan sets and see where the lines are. But then when you go out in the real world, it can't account for, oh, maybe the ground shift or something moved or something like that. So it's, just those are good things to recognize when you're dealing with AI.
Hmm. Yeah, and I guess thanks for adding those. And I think that it kind of makes me another point that I would add on this is that one of the places where I've seen collaborations break down is that, often government data is really it's pretty messy, and it's not the sort of like ideal data set that people might imagine, that technologists sort of envision receiving. And sometimes the meaning of a particular variable or value or entry really could not be interpreted except for, the inner knowledge that a worker in that agency has. But often the staff in that agency don't necessarily know, like, oh, which are the things that I need to communicate about the data, because if I don't, the data scientist will misinterpret this information and their analysis will go completely off in the wrong direction. So that you're sort of like your waterline thing made me think of that. But I think even that sense of like, what nuanced information that's not apparent from the data itself do I need to share, is another example of, I think, where those collaborations can break down, and the types of things that potentially on the government side people could be, more maybe informed or empowered to figure out like, okay, what's the right level of information to be giving to inform this analysis?
If go ahead.
Yeah, I was all great points. I was going to maybe add on the point about AI. Um, the system that we were having our participants build in this experiment is a deterministic system. It is an if-else set of system prompts. And the nice thing about that is we can really cleanly match what like the text of the rules are to what the code is. But as soon as exactly what you're saying about AI lacking nuance, as soon as we move to kind of like a system that is an LLM or a large language model, a chatbot, maybe we don't have that same ability to do that matching, that same type of evaluation. So yeah, when we're moving from these kind of rules-based systems to an AI-based system, yeah, our evaluation practices need to change because we've got different kinds of system internals. And it's so we were looking at deterministic systems. AI systems are going to be a whole new kind of bag of worms to figure out how to evaluate.
Naadra, thank you so much, Nell. Naadra.
Yeah, it looks like William is saying the same thing here. And I'm just curious about the extent to which this was talked about. It seems like a first principles kind of conversation. Like, is it even possible to do this in a responsible way, specifically when we're thinking about sentencing or things like this? There's a considerable amount of judgment that's happening, human judgment that's happening, and context consideration that is not programmable on the fly. So I'm curious to know the extent to which this was a conversation, if at all.
I mean, this is definitely like in the backdrop of all of our work. I'd say for both Nell and I, we are quite critical about the development and deployment of a lot of these tools, often because of uh, those factors that you were mentioning. I think a lot of these cases, these sorts of models are not appropriate or miss out a lot of the important context of how decisions should be made, and yet receive too much deference. And so I think, in a way, some of the work we're doing is an effort to uh, like I think that's not the sort of primary focus of these papers from out today, almost because we're trying to provide like I feel like different types of arguments to convince our colleagues who maybe are a bit less convinced by the sort of broader argument about the fundamental incompatibility on that sort of like normative or conceptual level, and trying to also just point out like even on these more practical levels, these tools are often broken and don't work, and we should assume that there's no easy fixes. So trying to like move, I guess, like down the stack closer to the ground of development and use, but definitely informed by, I'd say, a lot of our broader skepticism about how some of these tools are being used writ large. And that's often kind of how sort of where we zoom out to at the end of these papers is to make those broader points.
Yeah. And maybe to the point of is law something that's appropriate to translate into code at all? I think that's been a big debate in the computational law community, and there's kind of what's driving. I think was driving the initial push was the sort of identification of a set of laws that were considered more like determinate rather than indeterminate. So things like tax rules, you know, people saw the value in potentially encoding them in software and then using them to like kind of as like a set of equations to compute, what you owe or something like that. And so there's been these sorts of particular domains of law that people really want to translate into code. But I think that how you feel about that is one thing. Yeah, we're obviously skeptical, but then we're also seeing this like kind of move into the more ambiguous and indeterminate types of law also being taken up and put into software. And so, especially with, I think, large language models. Um, and so, yeah, definitely a concern that we were interested in and kind of were looking with this project at kind of empirically what happens when you do kind of both of these kind of types of translation tasks. If you have like a clear set of rules, we see that that gets mistranslated. And then if you have kind of an ambiguous set of provisions, those also kind of get distorted, kind of made to be compressed into sort of set categories rather than taking on kind of the full interpretive quality of law.
I'm really loving the questions from the group because you've all zeroed in on exactly why this paper has stayed with me. And when Nella is using words like mistranslated, distorted, big picture takeaway for me from this work is just how delicate and easy to distort the law is when you're trying to translate it into AI. And that's so important because we're seeing so much hope for ways that AI can, let's say, improve access to benefits. But if it's incompatible in some ways at this more fundamental level or requires a higher standard of care, that's something that I hope stays with everyone. And the last thing I just wanted to appreciate about this paper before we go to the next one is that very often these systems are developed and pushed into the world, and we try to figure out what happened later. But a beauty in what Ben and Nell have done is to create these experimental conditions where they literally were listening to the kinds of conversations that the developer teams were having to try to deeply pull apart, like where exactly is the requirement getting translated into the spec, getting translated into the system. And that is such a rare kind of insight to have in the work that we all do. So that's where I wanted to leave this half of our call before we turn over to the second paper. And thanks so much, Albert, for giving us the opportunity to talk about that one.
Yeah, thank you, Meg, for the perfect segue there, and credit to Nell for going through the many hours of recordings and transcripts of our teams actually putting this together to, yeah, not just show that the tools are flawed, but to be able to identify here is where in the process it became flawed, which I think is a really valuable piece of that project. So the paper that I'm going to talk about is now looking at the post-deployment side of these tools, and thinking about, okay, if we assume that these tools are probably going to be flawed in some way in the development process, what happens once they get deployed? To what extent are there good avenues for identifying and correcting those flaws within already deployed tools? And so that has led us to this project focusing on algorithm auditing policies. Yeah. And actually, if you just want to go to the next slide at this point, we can kind of jump through that. And so one of the big things that we've seen across the US are various types of initiatives to require algorithm auditing, or broadly third-party audits, where some group that is not the agency or developers of a system go through and try to actually assess, does this tool work? Can we find errors in this system? And this is becoming one of the very common policy solutions for responding to the harms that we've seen from government algorithms, and the awareness that there can be errors and biases and mistakes in these systems. Algorithm audits are, I'd say, probably like the major solution that have been posed. And so in this project, we wanted to assess these policies and kind of take our understanding of the limits of these tools, and see, how well do audits actually handle them. So if you want to go to the next, let's see. Actually, we can just kind of keep going. Yeah, so that's what we're looking at is to sort of compare what do these audits actually call for, and are they equipped to address the realities of what a public sector algorithmic system looks like. So we had two specific research questions. The first was to just get the lay of the land of these auditing policies, to say, okay, what are the auditing policies out there? How many are there? What state are they in? And what sort of arrangements are they setting up? What are the assumptions that they are clearly acting on in terms of how these audits are being structured? And then we wanted to look at whether those assumptions actually hold for a real system. So essentially, what we want to do is say, okay, here on the one hand are the assumptions embedded in these auditing policies. And then we want to compare that and say, do those assumptions actually match the reality? And if they don't, what does that tell us about where these policies are likely to fall short? So briefly, in terms of our methods, we started by gathering audit policies. We ultimately settled on a set of 25 policies in the US that span city, state, and federal. Some are passed, some are proposed. And we found a lot of overlap in these policies. Definitely even just some similar, like literally similar language that's used across them. And broadly, what we see is assumptions about the types of harms and how to identify and fix those harms. So there's the assumption that the primary issue that these audits are concerned about are biases. So particularly racial discrimination in terms of the outputs of these tools. That's really what they're looking for. The policy set up audits to around an assumed limited scope of systems, kind of assuming like, okay, there is a piece of software and we can assess whether that software is correct or incorrect and biased or unbiased. And then assume that if they find an issue, that issue will be fixed. So, a pretty kind of nice, simple, straightforward assumption of what's going on here. We have a tool, we can assess if it's biased or not, and if we find bias, the tool will be fixed. So that's kind of what we found looking at these policies. And then to do the comparison, we did a detailed case study of a Michigan system. Michigan is known as MIDAS, the Michigan Integrated Data Automated System. It was used by the Unemployment Insurance Agency. And many of you have probably heard about this system because it's kind of a notorious case of government automation go wrong. When it was first deployed, there were scandals around robo fraud and just countless cases of the system accusing people of fraud without any basis. And then further issues popped up during the pandemic when there were, of course, additional kind of strain on unemployment agencies across the country. So this was these issues were documented in a number of audits that were done by the Michigan Auditor General, one audit by Deloitte, and broadly, I'd say Nell also was involved in some of the lawsuits that happened over the last few years, and so she was able to really go quite deep based on that experience, working with lawyers who are trying to get relief for some of the people who were harmed by this system. She was able to go really deep into the source code and the details and all of that. So now to kind of move into our findings, what I'll focus on are kind of the disconnects between the assumptions and what we found in our case study. So in terms of what harm there actually is, it's clear that these policies, the focus on discriminatory bias is far too narrow and leaves out many of the types of harms that MIDAS was produced. So MIDAS, the primary issue with MIDAS was not discriminatory bias. I don't think there were any notable instances of that, but there were tons of issues, right? There were many of the people who were accused of fraud, they were denied payments and had paychecks or other funds clawed back. And later lawsuits determined that this was done without due process. So there were constitutional rights violations. There were security failures. There were kind of like shocking basic mistakes that the system made, where many people, because of a bug, many people's appeals of decisions were deemed to be late, even though they were actually submitted on time. And in some cases, even actually wastes of taxpayer funds, which is ironic because one of the main motivations of the state in adopting this tool was to save money and cut down on fraud. And in many cases, there were a number of cases where this actually led to increases in costs and let many fraud cases and actually paid out benefits to fraudsters because of errors in the system. And that's exactly right, Albert. It was really about rule-based and process-based issues. So really just errors in how the system was working and breakdowns in how the system was integrated into an overall process of giving people appropriate notice that there was an issue and making sure that information was accessible and giving them the ability to respond. So that's one piece of this. But then we also found that these audit policies, beyond just kind of misconstruing what types of harms are possible and are worth looking for, also had a pretty narrow understanding of what would be involved in finding harm. To give just, the MIDAS system is so much more complex than what these systems imagine. MIDAS is not just a static, individualized model. It has many complex subsystems, and often and is not acting fully autonomously, but is providing information or is used by workers in the unemployment agency. And so the actual outcomes of adopting this tool are really based on things like how are the workers using it, which would be impossible to tell just from saying like, is the tool correct on its own, is actually not really the pathway of harm, because it depends on how people are using it. So in one case during the pandemic, there was an effort to deal with the rapidly changing circumstances. The agency decided to change some of its protocols for how workers should deal with certain types of cases. And the issue, though, because the system had not really been updated properly, but the issue is that information was not communicated uniformly. So you had half of the workers following one set of rules, another half of workers following the other set of rules. And so it was a total mess where many incorrect decisions were made, and it became impossible to backtrack and figure out which decisions were correct and which decisions were made under which set of rules. So again, this is all about, that's one example of an issue that could not be determined just from looking at the technical records of how the tool made recommendations or processed information, but really depends on the integration within a concrete use case. Nedra, did you want to ask a question about this?
Yeah, I do. And these evaluations, are they assessing the actual like tech stack? So in other words, you mentioned that these systems have a lot of different subsystems. So I'm like, oh, this sounds like a system that has a semantic layer somewhere, or they're like they have to actually resolve the entities, so we're talking about the same person. So when we're doing these assessments, it sounds like folks are looking at outcomes, right? And it seems to me that it might be helpful to say what is actually happening in the stack itself that might be driving some of these problems. And I'm just curious to know if the focus is on like observable outcomes and harms to people, or are we also trying to track, or were they trying to track back to look at, is it a specific component of the system that might be doing something?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is exactly the disconnect that we are pointing out here, which is that the way that policies are setting up audits are really just based on observable outcomes. But in practice, you have to look much deeper, not just to identify issues, but to understand where they're coming from. And so in the recommendation, where we get to in terms of recommendations is doing much more of that analysis of the tech stack to see how these different components are interacting with one another, rather than setting it up merely as an exercise in evaluating system outputs. So, yeah. And then the sort of final set of issues that we found were in terms of these policies having what turns out to be pretty unrealistic optimism about the ability of audits to turn into change and improvement. So, these audit policies, again, are kind of written under the assumption that we'll do an audit, and if there's an issue, someone will fix the issue, or the system, if it can't be fixed, will be replaced. But in practice, that tends not to happen. We found in MIDAS that these issues that were pointed out persisted for years. And often the unemployment insurance agency described, we just don't have the resources or the time or the internal expertise to correct these problems. So actually, in a way, the most dispiriting thing about this case is that so many of the issues, even when they were identified, did not get fixed because of lack of resources, lack of enforcement powers, things like that. But again, the audit policies that are being kind of presented as solutions to algorithmic harms don't make any accounting for that. They really just assume that the information from an audit will lead to change. So from there, we turn to, let me turn to some of the recommendations. Maybe I'll skip over this for the moment. Just want to make sure we have time for discussion. So yeah, we kind of tried, after doing all of this analysis, to figure out, what can we do about this? One of the broader pieces that we take away from this study is that these algorithm auditing policies that are now coming out. Again, many of these policies have been proposed. They're still actively being debated, but are really quite weak in this handy meme that Nell created. And what's interesting is that there actually are long-standing authorities in states that are able to do pretty robust audits. And so the audits of MIDAS were not done by an algorithm auditing policy. They were done by the state Office of the Auditor General, which was created, several decades ago, and has a much more robust mandate and powers to go deeper than just analyzing a specific technical system, but are actually able to go deeper into that tech stack and into the operational workflows and things like that. So we definitely see just this sort of disconnect between existing auditing entities that are pretty robust, but not perfect, and then these policies today that are kind of creating an auditing regime from scratch, but are quite weak in practice. One of the other broad themes that really comes away from this is the role of vendors in these issues. And now we'll speak a little bit more about this at the end, but one of the issues that both the agency and the state auditor were brushing up against was the incompetence and intransigence and opacity of the vendor of the MIDAS system. In this case, it was a company called Fast Enterprises. And in many cases, it was difficult to do the audit because the auditor couldn't get complete data from the company, or when an issue would come back, the unemployment agency would ask the vendor for a fix, and the vendor wouldn't do it that quickly, or they wouldn't do it, or there'd be all sorts of issues in the back and forth of actually getting the vendor to make corrections to the system. And again, there was a lack of enforcement. The auditor and the agency had very little ability to actually enforce vendor action to remediate the system, and in fact continued to renew contracts and give more money to Fast Enterprises even after many of these issues had come out. So there are some more concrete recommendations that we do highlight in the paper that I'll work through pretty quickly. I mean, I think one thing we talk about is that I think are some of the more interesting ones are yeah, having a more open-ended a sense of what types of harms are worth looking for rather than predisposing to saying, let's just look for bias, recognizing that there can be many issues. And rather than trying to come up with some sort of a priori list, it'd be worth doing a sort of open process to say, to ask workers in the agency and people who have interacted with the system to say, what do you want us to look for? What are the types of harms that or errors or issues that you think an audit should investigate? And that's kind of what happened in the Michigan case. Their audits were guided by, unfortunately, many issues had already cropped up. So the audits were guided by, complaints from lawyers and policymakers who were hearing many of these issues. And then the audit could be focused on what actually matters rather than an assumption at the outset that bias or something else like that is what's worth investigating. We have a number of recommendations about how to improve audit construction in terms of keeping track of updates and things like that. And then also talk finally at the end about how to improve, including as we talked about earlier, testing interoperability of components and looking at how people are using the system. But then also it's really important to find ways to strengthen these audits to actually enforce corrections. And so making sure that audits are not just kind of leaving off at a finding of error or harm, but are providing both resources for remediation as well as penalties or stronger provisions to actually enforce change, because it's you can do all of this work to actually do a robust audit and find issues that are harming a lot of people, but then it's pretty disappointing if after all of that you actually don't get any sort of change, either because the agency doesn't want to or they feel that they don't have the ability to. So I think we really emphasize that these policies need to take seriously the need for getting agencies and vendors to act in response to audits. So I'll hand over to Nell for some final thoughts here.
Yeah, thanks, Ben. So I think kind of to synthesize these two projects, a lot of the issues we've laid out here are traceable to the current paradigm of public agencies procuring software from private vendors. And this arrangement institutionalizes the disciplinary divide. When using private vendors, there are silos with legal and policy experts sitting in one organization and software developers in another. And that complicates collaboration. Without technical expertise, agencies struggle to evaluate vendor products. And times when it's really important to move fast, like during the pandemic, we see a disconnect, a very slow percolation of policy changes through the software. What we want to do on the public side is not necessarily matched by what the private vendors are prepared to support. And because we're dealing with systems that are often proprietary and black boxed, it's really hard for lessons of failures to travel. We had to do a lot of work to kind of excavate these problems of MIDAS, and to this day, the vendor refuses to share any source code with us. These combinations of factors lead to poor performance of computational legal systems. And what's worse is that the contracts are often very duplicative, with agencies in multiple jurisdictions, each having to contract to buy a version of software that's billed as custom, but frequently shares many of the same goals and features as products used in other jurisdictions. So if we were to change to a public development model, we could sit legal experts and software developers side by side, better facilitate collaboration. We've actually seen this done with the US Digital Service, who had a really remarkable performance in developing the IRS's direct file. There wouldn't be some profit motive warping claims of performance. If we invest in public sector technical expertise, systems could be inspected and evaluated directly. We could use that technical expertise when making policy decisions and actually iterate on the policies themselves by considering their technical feasibility rather than potentially handing off a really complicated policy that we don't realize is going to take a long time to implement. And we could share information about how best to do this development across jurisdictions. All of these things we believe would greatly improve these systems' performance. And we could potentially save on the cost front as well, because we could easily share software across jurisdictions rather than requiring a thicket of contracts to give governments access to standard tools. We think that GovAI could be a home for this work, with the potential next step of identifying a lightweight tool with many commonalities across jurisdictions, where we could actually test out the approach of building rather than buying. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nell and Ben. And I'll just say, for folks that are interested in that idea of co-development in the public sector, highly recommend you take a look at the use cases committee come August, and get into some of the conversations that they'll be having. Uh, Now, Ben, I just wanted to ask a quick question here, because we're talking a lot about the audit and the audit findings. One of the things that I've found in the public sector is that audit can take like a year and a half. And at that point, and it's incredibly important, but at that point, a lot of work has already happened. And I'm curious if you've seen any good examples or even any attempts at, I'm just putting this in quotes, but like a micro test or a micro audit, because it felt like a lot of the issues that Midas ran into were things that I theoretically could have caught 2 days into the process. If they were rules-based issues, I didn't need a data sample. I could see it. Have you seen examples or ways that people can start making those first initial course correct checks more possible?
I've seen some proposals. I don't know
Mm,
about successful implementations yet, but some concept that's kind of been put forward is this idea of continuous monitoring. So rather than kind of having these annual audits or something that kind of lag a year or two behind what's actually happening in a system, if we have ways to um, be able to check outcomes as they're kind of coming out and affecting people. I think we're still working on how to implement that kind of methodology, but there have been some recent proposals for monitoring. I think negative reactions to drugs based on like reports given to the FDA. I would be happy to share out that kind of illustrate this continuous monitoring idea.
Yeah, and I think this also does connect back to the sort of vendor versus in-house development question, because when you have a vendor, unfortunately, they often are shockingly have little incentives baked into the contract in terms of the performance of the system. And there's this large, again, that disciplinary divide. So there's sort of a disconnect where a tool gets handed to agency staff and they might not fully understand it or even have access to the internals. Whereas I do think if you had developers in-house that are both, hopefully would have a better understanding of the processes, but also would be able to kind of do more of those rapid-based tests. They'd be more committed to the mission of the agency and avoiding errors, but also could do more of those. You could really cut down the turnaround time on doing some of these tests and then making fixes in a sort of more agile fashion, rather than needing to interface with the vendor who may not have much time or interest in making a quick turnaround. Yeah. So here.
Yeah, hi. This is very helpful. Thank you both for this wonderful uh, knowledge sharing and deck. My question was like to the similar point of Albert, like by the time audit comes, that's just to validate and confirm, but not like proactively trying to prevent some of the things. So if I don't know if it can be completely just outside the coding world, but even generally, like AI or not, there is toll gates in the life cycle of any software implementation. And similarly, for these things too, maybe there should be a gate review on some of the framework or something that you should watch, do that, and then maybe proceed at every level. So even whether the development happens in-house or not, even as gatekeepers or the approvers, um, I'm of the opinion, I don't know if that really happens everywhere, it doesn't happen at City of Detroit too, but at the software architecture level, the code walk, the testing, at every stage, if you have gate reviews, maybe that can help. Was that ever a consideration?
A bit, yeah. I mean, I don't think we got too deep into that specifically, but I think, I'd say definitely we do emphasize that, I'd say from all of us, that like audits cannot be the primary way of protecting the public from errors and harms of automation in government. If we kind of look at the overall scope of these two papers together, we've shown that on the development side, we should assume that errors are pretty endemic to the development of these tools, that there's probably going to be some form of mistranslations or bugs in the systems, but also that our existing frameworks for post hoc remediation and analysis are pretty shoddy. They are, not going to miss a lot of issues, don't enforce changes, and as Albert was saying, would take a long time to even provide analysis. So I do think more of these sort of process-based, intermediate steps are really important places to look if we're going to be automating decision-making at all. To look at procurement as a site of how can you create stronger contracts, in-house development, and then looking at the development process itself, can we improve interim evaluations that would somewhat limit the scope of errors that get integrated into these systems. I mean, there's no single place where everything can be solved. There's no silver bullet, but I would say we are really trying to push forward this caution, sort of alarm bells that kind of across the life cycle of these systems, there are errors being introduced and quite insufficient mechanisms for actually fixing those errors once they've been implemented.
Such a phenomenal summary. Nell, I want to give you the last word, but I just also wanted to acknowledge we might be at time and to say thanks everybody for taking the time out. This is really important work. And if you have any further questions for Ben and Nell, feel free to send them to me. I'll make sure you get connected. And if you have other things that you want to hear programmed in this space, throw your suggestions, requests into the chat, or feel free to email them to me directly. Nell, for anybody else on the call, I do want to give you the last word.
Thanks. Yeah, I think maybe my primary takeaway is thank you so much for having us, and the enthusiasm I see for GovAI serving as a home for public development. I love that. I hope that carries forward because I think that this is a really unique opportunity to scale up some of this public development work.
Yeah, thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ben and Nell. Yeah, it's so exciting. We're all going into a fiscally sponsored project phase of GovAI Coalition. So thanks for joining us, everybody. Thanks, Albert. Thanks, Ben and Nell. Catch you in the next one.
Thank you.